The robe was never just fabric, and from the moment Princess Anne realized where it had been found, something shifted beneath the surface of the palace. By sunrise, the quiet that once felt ceremonial had turned heavy, deliberate, almost threatening. This was not the calm of tradition, but the kind of silence that gathers when something fragile is about to fracture. Anne had seen enough to know this was no simple mistake. The placement, the explanations, the carefully rehearsed responses from staff, none of it aligned with the rigid order she had known her entire life. And unlike others who might have chosen diplomacy over instinct, Anne did not look away. The moment she sensed that Queen Elizabeth's legacy had been touched in a way that felt calculated rather than respectful, her response was not emotional. It was precise, cold, and deeply intentional. What followed was not announced, not recorded, and certainly not approved through traditional channels. Instead, Anne moved quietly, assembling a small circle of individuals whose loyalty was not to protocol, but to truth. These were people who understood the weight of history, the importance of detail, and the consequences of silence. There were no formal meetings, no official notes, only whispered conversations, handwritten instructions, and movements so discreet they barely left a trace. And that alone was enough to unsettle those who understood her methods, because when Anne chose not to rely on the system, it meant she no longer trusted it. At first, the question seemed simple: how did the robe get there? But Anne was never interested in simple answers. The real question, the one that lingered beneath every polite explanation, was far more dangerous. Who made it possible? Because something so deeply tied to Queen Elizabeth's reign does not move without intention. It requires access, authority, and above all, silence. Someone had to approve it, someone had to overlook it, and someone had to ensure it went unnoticed until it was too late. Inside the palace, the atmosphere began to change. Conversations grew shorter, eye contact became fleeting, and routines that once felt effortless turned cautious. Small inconsistencies began to surface. Records that didn't quite match, timelines that felt adjusted, details that seemed just slightly too convenient. And then, quietly, a name emerged. Not a prominent figure, not someone accustomed to scrutiny, but an individual positioned perfectly within the machinery of royal logistics. Someone who understood movement, storage, and the invisible pathways that objects could take when they were meant to remain unseen. As Anne's circle followed these threads, a pattern began to take shape. Items connected to Queen Elizabeth were being marked, reviewed, and then temporarily removed from standard records, only to reappear in places that raised uncomfortable questions. And in that moment, the robe stopped being the center of the issue. It became something else entirely, a signal. Within royal life, symbols are never accidental. They carry weight far beyond their physical form, shaping perception, authority, and legacy in ways that words cannot. The robe, with its history and meaning, was more than a ceremonial object. It was a statement. To possess it, to display it, even to quietly place it within reach, was to suggest something deeper, a connection, a claim, perhaps even a transition of influence that had never been publicly acknowledged. This realization reframed everything. What had first appeared as a misplaced artifact now felt deliberate, almost strategic. And at the center of that possibility stood a question that no one dared to address directly. Was this an isolated decision, or part of something larger, an effort to reshape how Queen Elizabeth's legacy would be seen in the years to come? At the same time, another layer of tension began to emerge, not from evidence, but from implication, because any path that led closer to answers also moved dangerously close to King Charles himself. Whether through awareness, oversight, or silence, his position could not remain entirely separate from the unfolding situation. Anne, bound by both loyalty and principle, refused to make assumptions, but she also refused to ignore the possibility that the truth might be more complicated than anyone was prepared to face. By the time Anne's private circle reached its next stage, the investigation had already begun to shift in scale. What started as a single anomaly was expanding into something far more intricate. Inventory logs revealed subtle discrepancies, sealed items showed signs of disturbance, and one record, small but significant, had disappeared entirely, as though it had never existed. These were not errors easily dismissed. They suggested coordination, or at the very least, a level of negligence that bordered on intentional. Inside the palace, pressure began to build from multiple directions. Advisors urged caution, emphasizing the risks of pursuing a matter that could destabilize the institution itself. The monarchy, after all, relies as much on perception as it does on truth. To expose internal fractures, especially those tied to the legacy of Queen Elizabeth, could create consequences far beyond the walls of any royal residence. But Anne was not guided by convenience. Her focus remained fixed, her approach unwavering. For her, this was no longer about speculation or rumor. It was about clarity, about understanding who had acted, who had allowed it, and whether the system designed to protect the crown had, in some way, failed it. And with that clarity came a decision to widen the scope, to follow every lead, and to accept whatever truth emerged, regardless of its impact. As the investigation extended beyond its original boundaries, one final detail began to surface, uncertain, unconfirmed, but impossible to ignore. A document, separate from those already examined, existing somewhere beyond the reach of standard records. Its contents remain unknown, but its implications are profound, because if authentic, it could change everything. It could validate certain actions, challenge others, and complicate a narrative that had already grown dangerously complex. Meanwhile, the public face of the palace remained unchanged. Engagements continued, appearances were maintained, and official statements revealed nothing. But behind that carefully preserved exterior, the reality was far less stable. Conversations took place in private, documents were reviewed with increasing urgency, and trust, once assumed, became something that had to be measured, questioned, and, in some cases, withdrawn entirely. At the center of it all stood Princess Anne, steady and unyielding. She had already crossed the point where retreat was possible, and those who understood her knew that she would not stop until every question had been answered. Not for spectacle, not for conflict, but for something far more enduring, the preservation of a legacy she believed could not be altered without consequence. And as the palace held its breath, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever had begun with the robe was no longer contained. It was unfolding, piece by piece, toward a conclusion that would not be quiet and would not be easily forgotten.